Today, two of our most popular contributors are joining us to talk about the future of the Conservative Party, the Maine trial, and what's happening south of the border. Sandy Garossino, our national columnist, and journalist Bruce Livesey. Welcome, both of you. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Hi, Linda. Hi, Bruce.
Hi,
I
Sandy.
hope you are going to give us the story behind the big stories you've both been working on. You've both been working on some incredible pieces. So I'm going to start with you, Bruce. Tell us about your piece.
So I wrote a story about the situation with the Conservative Party these days, and basically whether or not its current woes are the fault of Stephen Harper. And so that's why I think the title is, Stephen Harper destroying the Conservative Party.
And how many people did you talk to for the story?
Ooh, between 25 and 30, I think. And I tried to basically interview just conservatives. I mean, I interviewed a handful of political scientists, but I was trying just only to interview people within the party, both old, people going back to the, when they used to be called the PC party, all the way up to the current generation.
And were people willing to talk to you? Did you have any problem? Did anybody hang up on you or Well,
there's a lot of people who wouldn't talk to me. It was a struggle getting people to talk to me. I mean, there were some people who were happy to talk, but it was actually a big challenge. And I think partially because perhaps it was, it was the National Observer and they don't
right.
trust the Observer given, obviously the political differences between the Observer and the Conservatives. But also, I think, given that I was wanting to talk to them about Stephen Harper, there seemed to be a bit of a concern, perhaps is the best way to put it, about talking about him.
Yeah, I was surprised at how many people were willing to talk with you. Can you just tell us, were there any big surprises for you in your conversations with conservatives about Stephen Harper?
Well, to a certain extent, there was if you went and talked to the sort of more red Tories, the more sort of liberal wing of the party, I mean, there was no surprise there that they think that the party's, stuck in a ditch, so to speak. I think that the more interesting thing was finding sort of more of the younger generation who were around Harper in some capacity, who were beginning to realize that it's after having lost two back-to-back elections, that something was wrong. And those were the more interesting conversations, I would say, because they, it was not always, some feel it's just, well, Scheer was a crappy leader, was, poor leader. If we get a better leader in, we'll win. Others could see we have a programmatic problem, meaning that the platform is not working.
I want to interrupt for a moment and just tell everybody the participants on the call, if you haven't been on one of these calls before, you can go down to the bottom of your screen and open up the chat. If you just want to participate in the conversation, talk to other people on the call, or if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and you'll see that on the far right of the options, and you click on that and you can start asking questions, and I'll get to your questions towards the end of the call. Sandy, you also wrote a piece on Harper recently. Can you tell us about that and what your thoughts are on Harper's presence now in the party?
Well, you hear, and as Bruce says, what you hear from everyone who is connected with the party is that Stephen Harper still has his grip on the party. But I think that when I drill down into the numbers, I think that to a certain extent, there's been a lot of myth about Stephen Harper, and he has enormous power within the party, but he has not really, effectively, his majority election was a fluke, and it happened because it came at a time of historical weakness within the Liberal Party. There was leadership. We went from Paul Martin to Stefan Dion to Michael Ignatieff, and it was going really, in a sense, from failure to failure after Jean Chrétien, and there are all kinds of reasons behind that, coupled with the extraordinary and brilliant rise of Jack Layton and the NDP in the 2011 election. And that combination opened up a pathway. That combination plus the rise or the power of the Bloc in Quebec, which mirrored a loss of power again by the Liberals in Quebec. And all of these influences really created, I mean, you could almost imagine a dunce walking into majority territory leading the Conservative Party at that stage. But Stephen Harper does an incredible job of projecting power. And I think he's overrated, frankly. But he still carries this aura, this myth, and he projects strength within the party. And I think he still influences. But how anybody is going to any conservative is going to achieve a majority government for the Conservatives, given the current environment, it's impossible for me to even, I can't see it unless there is a complete collapse. You see that combination again, rise of NDP, collapse of Liberals, the opening a path.
Well, one of the things that I heard people talking about in your story, Bruce, that's so interesting what you're saying, Sandy, about a total collapse and no way that they could possibly take power again right now. But what I heard people saying in your piece was really these were conservatives looking for a transformation of the Conservative Party. Did I get that right, Bruce?
I think there's, okay, so I think this is the way I would frame it, is that I would say probably the base of the party is still enamored with the idea that if we can just find the next Stephen Harper with the same platform, we will win. Mm-hmm. I think there are a growing set of voices that are saying, ooh, maybe the platform is a problem. And I think that what they're not taking into consideration is that there's a sort of electoral math that plays into this. The Tories, their base gets them to about 30% of the vote. To win a minority, you need about around 35, mm-hmm. and a majority around 40. Well, that mm-hmm. means you've got to convince, especially in the very seat-rich urban hubs like Vancouver, especially Toronto, Montreal, you've got to convince people in those regions that you represent their interests. And that is the mm-hmm. programmatic problem with the party now, is they are completely clued out to the fact that those voters don't want to vote for that particular platform. Mm-hmm. And that's the contradiction the party is in at the moment, is that I would say the base just thinks, well, we just need the next Stephen Harper to lead us back into power. I think that they need to change the platform, and that's what they're not willing to do at the moment.
That's so interesting, Bruce. I'm wondering what you think. You know, I heard a lot in your piece. There was some descriptions of people who were like, this has become the party of, I hope I have this right, white men, the BlackBerry, not the iPhone. But what about, there's another element that didn't really come up in your piece, and I wonder what both of you think about this. What is the role of sort of the born-again movement, the born-again Christian movement, the evangelicals, that seem to fuel some of Harper's rise to power in the past? Is that still at play in the Conservative Party?
I think the social conservative base is enormously powerful. And the reason that Peter MacKay and Aaron O'Toole have taken the positions they're doing, which are ludicrous in terms of ever trying to get elected, is because the base has this enormous social conservative element. And in order to win the leadership, you've got to pander to them.
Right, Sandy?
Well, and I also think that corresponds to regional strengths too, don't you think, Bruce? I feel like that is that's a suburban but largely rural issue, right. and more in Alberta and say in the Fraser Valley in British Columbia and in certain other regions, but it doesn't play in any of the areas that the federal Conservatives need to take power. They have got to get into the 905, the Greater Toronto Area, and they've got to get into Quebec. And all of these issues, the more that they play, and as you say, Bruce, pander to those issues, they're powerful within the party, they're niche to ordinary voters, and they're anathema to large swaths of the populace that the Conservatives need to win. They're actually campaigning against themselves the more they play to that, is my feeling.
And Sandy, can you guys unpack that for us a little bit? Like pandering, what are those issues? Are you talking about gay marriage? Are you talking about
abortion? Gay
marriage. Yeah, mm-hmm. Those are the two issues that the social conservatives get them all agitated, and they want to have something done about them. And Harper was brilliant at keeping that element under lock and key, and Scheer was not. Scheer is an open social conservative, and nobody trusted the fact, what his position. Nobody trusted him on those issues. That's what probably lost him the election. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the social conservative base is an enormous problem for that party.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I don't know if like whoever wins the leadership, I mean, in order to win an election, they're going to have to basically ignore where the base is, and at the moment, I don't see that happening.
One of the things that I felt about this, it's interesting because Ken Boson-Cole, who is a conservative strategist, and he is doing opinion pieces, and I interviewed Jen Gerson, and I interviewed him, and he was talking about the strategic importance of breaking into the 905 in the Greater Toronto area. It was his feeling that, being much more progressive on climate change, on carbon tax, that this was absolutely essential to get in there. He actually let something slip that I thought was fascinating. He talked about the critical importance. He talked about the 905, and this was very interesting, and you'll see why. He talked about the 905 as being Dougie and Heather's, which is kind of an interesting take of the 905, which is now majority visible minority population and almost 50% immigrant. So to be talking about the 905, this is the part of Toronto, the suburban areas around Toronto, to calling the 905 Dougies and Heathers was an interesting take for a conservative strategist. But he also said it was absolutely critical to get Dougie and Heather mad. That was the key to taking an election, is to make Dougie and Heather mad. Well, I don't think that even just look at that framing, Dougie and Heather. This is not, even Ken Boson-Cole, who's talking about getting with the program on climate change, being more progressive, being more forward-looking, taking the party somewhere else, and he is still, his mental picture is in the wrong place. But it was very revealing, this business about if your voter base does not get angry, they will not come out. And that is the key for the Conservatives to win an election.
What do you think about that, Bruce?
Well, I think the Conservatives, there's no question, have especially under Harper, were very good at getting their voters out. I think the problem now is it doesn't work. It doesn't win them elections anymore. That the both, again, because of the platform issues, because the Liberals got their act together, as Sandy pointed out, they just can't, they really fundamentally have to change so many things of that party, which they are not recognizing. And I think that's what Sandy's mentioning, is that there's kind of this denial, enormous denial about the problems the party faces. And everything I've seen from the current leadership race indicates they haven't woken up to that reality.
Mm-hmm. You don't hear, for instance, in Ontario, the Liberals lost one seat in the last federal election, during an election in which they were incredibly weakened and went from a majority to a minority and lost seats everywhere. They only lost one seat in Canada, in Ontario, and in the Greater Toronto area, they won on average by a margin of 17 points over the Conservatives. 17 points in an election in which they were terribly weakened. So how is Stephen Harper's vision going to take that party anywhere?
Well,
I wonder.
Sorry,
Please go ahead. Yeah.
The problem they face is Alberta and Jason Kenney and the oil sands. This is a party that was really founded on a Western vision, and the Western vision was developing Alberta as this engine of the economy and the oil sands. Well, guess what? The oil sands are now, are out of favor. That is simply not going to be, climate change on the oil sands. You can't win elections saying that that is the future of the country. But they, the leadership, Harper, Kenney, who are the two most powerful players in that party, they are determined not to change anything on that front. So if you're a Peter MacKay or an Aaron O'Toole and you think I can win an election if I basically turn my back on the oil sands and do a good platform on climate change, that's not going to happen in this particular construction of the party.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot more we could get into, and I think we still might in this conversation about, I'm really interested in what you're saying about Alberta and just, Sandy, you on Ontario, and we've got Ford and Kenney in those provinces, and do you think that the Conservative Party is going to just maintain its strength provincially and not be able to make a comeback federally? Is that what we're really looking at now?
Oh, I don't have a feel for Ontario except driving into the data. I grew up in Alberta, so I do have a feel for that region, and I think that Alberta's in not post-traumatic stress; they're in traumatic stress right now. Clearly, we know that the collapse of the oil and gas industry and the collapse of employment there, but now with COVID virus, and we know we haven't even begun, I think, nationally to feel what will be the incredible economic pain that is going to come from this pandemic. But Alberta is probably going to be ground zero of it because they were already badly on their heels. And at the same time, they've suffered an enormous loss of power. If you think of where Alberta was going into 2015, in 2014, oil was probably around $100 a barrel. They were riding high. Their median household income was about the highest in the country. They had the prime minister. They had multiple cabinet ministers. They had all the major banks were relocating major offices to Western Canada, to Calgary. This was the force. This was, along with Toronto, going to be almost like a second capital city. And now they have nobody even in government in Alberta. I think they've got an NDP. One NDP is all conservative, so they don't have any cabinet ministers. They don't have a prime minister. They have lost power. They have lost economic power. All of those plans to relocate and build, they are a ghost town economically. And politically, they are deeply and profoundly alienated from the rest of the country, but I don't know a way back for them. I don't know what the future can possibly hold for them. I don't know, Bruce, what your thoughts are about them as a region.
In Alberta or in Ontario?
Well, maybe I'll leave that to Linda because
before we move on to getting that quick answer from you, Bruce, I just wanted to tell our participants, those of you who don't know, Sandy's written in great depth about Alberta, and particularly Jason Kenney and his move to create the War Room and foreign funding conspiracy. So really encourage you to read Sandy's work on that. It's amazing. Bruce, what do you think about Ontario?
Well, prior to the pandemic, Doug Ford was in deep trouble, and I think he was going to lose the next election. His term in office has been an unmitigated disaster, and he was polling awfully. He was just an incredibly bad premier. And then the pandemic comes along, and I wouldn't say he's transformed, but he somehow he got the message that, you know, he's got to respond in a logical fashion, which he did. Like he didn't go Donald Trump. You know, he was rational, and so he's managed the pandemic fairly well, and that's revived his fortunes. But up until the pandemic, he was in deep trouble. He had alienated everybody, and he had just, you know, he gutted every bit of progressive legislation he could get his hands on, and I mean, it was just you know, cronyism, nepotism. It was a disaster. Now, you know, there's supposed to be an election, I think it's next year. Will he win the next election? I think there's a good chance he may. We'll see. But yeah, I mean, it's bizarre in the sense that he was heading to being a one-term premier until the pandemic came along.
That's fascinating. And I think that's a good segue right into the topic I wanted to discuss with both of you, because you've also both written a lot about it. Sandy, you tweet about it a lot. You guys can follow Sandy at Garossino. You can follow Bruce at Livesey 416, and me at Linda_Solomon. So my question to you is, looking south of the border, this has just been a terrifying week in news about COVID-19 in America. What are you guys seeing, and what are you guys thinking about it? And what do you think this means about Trump's prospects?
Well, I'm
Bruce.
Sorry. Okay, so I mean, if you look at going back to Ronald Reagan, the direction of American politics, which was basically, you know, it was the rise of neoliberalism, the end of the so-called welfare state, you know, the New Deal type of government, and the capture of the state by largely the billionaire class. This was very predictable, what we're seeing today, which is the inability of the government to actually respond to a real crisis internally, not like, you know, invading another country, but actually an internal crisis where they actually have to look after Americans. Because for the last 30 to 40 years, they've been doing everything possible to ensure that the state does not look after Americans. So I think if you look at the trajectory of this is the sum result of a program that began in the 70s and 80s to, in effect, ensure that the state did nothing for the average American citizen.
Yeah, it's the death of the New Deal, the complete destruction of everything that happened after the Great Depression, when it was another time when Americans were just absolutely left at loose ends. And it ushered in a whole new era of government sanity and help for regular people in America. But that's just been desecrated. And Sandy, what do you think about it?
Well, I'm incredibly concerned. I watch the numbers in each of the states closely every day. I watch the numbers across North America every day, and it's incredibly encouraging to see the results starting to happen in Ontario and Quebec, which of course were the hardest hit. It's shocking to see what is coming in Texas and Florida. California is back again, rising precipitously. And when you look at that curve and you know there's more to come, there's much worse to come because of the complete and utter failure. I would disagree with Bruce a little bit about the inability of the American state to address this. I think that it was astonishingly politicized by Donald Trump, who was terribly anxious right from the very beginning that his stock market, all he cares about is getting reelected and the stock market. And if the Dow is up, that is good for him, and he figures his polls are going to be good. He doesn't even really pay attention to unemployment numbers or to other economic indicators. His one indicator is what's happening with the Dow and the NASDAQ, and the S&P. And I think that he totally focused on, can the Dow stay up? And he completely ignored what the disaster that was waiting. Well, now it's just going to be an incredible demolition. And I worry about the health impacts. And something that we don't really think about as much in Canada is that all of these people, I think there are now about 40 million people that are unemployed in the United States as a result of this pandemic, and they have lost their health care.
Yeah.
Meanwhile,
they have no safety net.
Donald Trump is trying to strip out Obamacare even further. And then there's the other thing, and to the extent that I think that one of the things that makes a pandemic very difficult to respond to socially and in a community, we've had all the business about the masks. Do we have masks? Do we not have masks? What do we do? And it's been invisible. If we're not seeing bodies in the street, you know, like the 1918 pandemic, we're not seeing those numbers. So in a way, it's very invisible. Well, I would say the very same thing is happening in the economy. There are going to be massive bankruptcies that haven't happened yet. There are going to be there are going to be more job losses. There are going to be businesses. We've got so many dead men walking economically, and that is an invisible force that we're not really perceiving. And I worry enormously that where this is all going to go, and the abject failure of the largest economy in the world to address this, and what the incredible damage to that economy, what the domino effect throughout the world is going to be. I think we're looking at a potential devastation of unbelievable proportions because of the failure of this one man.
I was going to say, I would disagree with one point, which is I think Trump was enormously concerned about the employment figures, because the way to win the second term is to have full employment. He could be a terrible president on every other front, but if everybody's got their job and generally are happy in that respect, his chances of winning a second term were pretty good. Once the pandemic essentially deep sixes the economy, he understands that is going to affect enormously his capacity to win the second term, which is all the polls indicate that. The second part is that the Republican Party has gone along with him to a T. There's been virtually no breaking of the ranks within the Republican Party, which shows that the Republican establishment, in effect, has lashed themselves to Trump, despite this disaster. And that to me speaks to how, in effect, they are still the party that is most wedded to the interest of the super rich, who we know don't care at all about your average American citizen.
But they will also abandon Trump as soon as they begin to think that he's going to lose.
But they haven't so far.
Oh, I think that you're starting to see those donor numbers start to come into the Democrats. And I think that Peggy Noonan was making this point in the Wall Street Journal, which is that the wealthy support for Donald Trump has been entirely transactional, and that as soon as they think that he is going to lose, and that if he's going to lose the Senate majority as well, they'll switch horses because they want to have influence on the other team.
Okay, so before we leave the topic of Trump, I want to do a little mini poll among this panel.
Oh, we haven't talked
Bruce,
about the polls yet, though. Where he's going? What's going to happen?
I know. We haven't talked about the polls yet, but I want to poll you guys. Will Donald Trump be the next president, Bruce Livesey?
No, I think he's going to lose. I mean, I think I would have given his chances pretty high if the pandemic had not come along. But I think he's going to lose.
Sandy Garossino.
I think he will lose too. I'm couching it because I thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. I'll always say she only lost by 77,000 votes in 3 states, but when you look at the polls very closely, and especially to me, the American election is always going to be decided by swing voters in swing states, which young voters and very progressive and left voters don't want to hear this. They all contend that the ability to bring new voters in and swing the pendulum further left is the way to win elections. I believe that this election is going to be decided in the suburbs of Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, Arizona, and Florida. And right now, Trump is underwater in almost every one of those states, badly underwater. Right now, he's at almost, Joe Biden has an almost historically record advantage over him. And you always wonder, well, there's a tendency to a regression to the mean. There's a tendency that the polls will swing back. I have another take on this, which may be wrong, but I feel like Donald Trump's brand proposition is that he was transgressive. He was willing to say things that people thought that they never thought they were going to be able to hear a leader say, and that he was a winner. And that he was this great, great winner, and he was going to be, and he was an alpha male. Well, right now, if your brand is that you're the strong man winner, and you're losing in the polls, and you're almost losing Texas, and you're losing in Michigan, you're losing Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Ohio, Trump is still more ahead. Well, what's your brand promise? If your brand is that you're a winner, and I tend to think that he's maybe more like a boy band that's out of style. And you look at things like that Tulsa rally, and you see it's not just that it was mostly empty, but that people were bored. And I think people are sick of it all. And Biden's brand promise is calm, decency, stability. And in these times, in the times of a pandemic and a looming economic crisis and disaster, and the other thing that Joe Biden has is compassion. You see that because, of course, everybody knows that this is a man who's had terrible personal losses, and it comes through. People feel that. And I think that Biden will take this.
Okay, thank you to you both about that. We'll be continuing this conversation in the fall, I'm sure, as we get closer to the election in the US, and watch what the ramifications are in Canada as well, in terms of whatever the rhetoric is in the US. It tends to spill over our border and influence us in all kinds of surprising and sometimes troubling ways. Sandy, you're working on a piece that's coming out tomorrow on the Meng case. Can you tell us about that piece, and can you tell us what's going on there?
Well, I have been watching this, the Meng Wanzhou extradition matter from the day that she was arrested on December 1st, 2018. And I have been concerned about this extradition from the moment that Donald Trump offered to barter her for trade concessions with China. I understand that so many people, and certainly the Prime Minister has talked about the importance of the rule of law as someone, and that waiting for this matter to go through its regular channels and not interfere with it. It's funny because I completely disagreed with the Prime Minister on how he dealt with SNC-Lavalin, and I completely disagree that I felt that he should have entirely left that matter in the hands of the Attorney General and not attempted to interfere. And I completely disagree with him. As a former prosecutor, I feel that there is always a place for prosecutorial discretion. And the reason that I'm especially concerned about this particular case is because of how badly the Americans have played this and how much they've abandoned their duty to be respectful of Canada's interests here. What we are all forgetting, and I don't think that very many commentators have looked at what the Americans are doing and what their strategy is here. But, and I'll be going over this more in the piece, but I think a lot of Canadians may have forgotten that this is not the first time that China has taken hostages taken Canadian hostages and held them for as much as 2 years when we have when we have supported an extradition warrant of a politically sensitive Chinese individual to a US extradition request. In 2014, the Americans sought a person from Richmond, BC, actually, Sue Bin, who was an extremely important figure in the cyber espionage that the Chinese had been conducting. And we arrested him and we held him. And at that point, the Chinese immediately took 2 Canadians hostage and held them, one of them for over 2 years, while this was all working its way through the system. This is not the first time, this is the second time. So my concern is that Meng Wanzhou is a much more peripheral and minor figure in the larger prosecution against Huawei that the Americans are pursuing. They do not need her. They do not need to prosecute any individuals at all. That was a prosecutorial choice. Having made that prosecutorial choice, they selected Canada. Meng Wanzhou had been traveling in 6 jurisdictions, including the UK, France, Japan, Belgium. She had been traveling in multiple other jurisdictions. Why would you choose Canada? That she was going to be in 9 jurisdictions that the US had an extradition treaty with. Why would the Americans select Canada to take the blow yet again? And as much as the Prime Minister says, well, if we give in to China, we just negotiate with them. Well, effectively, that's what the Americans did with Sue Bin when they did a plea deal. And that was, I think, as I look at the circumstances, there's been no public acknowledgement of this, but as I look at the circumstances, it looks to me like the American Department of Justice under the Barack Obama administration did make a plea arrangement in order to win the Canadian freedom. And here under the Donald Trump administration, they're pursuing a very minor figure at enormous risk. This should have been a diplomatic crisis the day that that request came in, because Meng Wanzhou is a minor figure. And we know that if an extradition request comes in from the United States for a politically sensitive Chinese individual in Canada, that our Canadians in China are at peril. They are in harm's way. And that's a diplomatic matter. It should have been treated as a diplomatic matter and not a legal question.
Bruce, you've also written, thank you, Sandy. That was a very deep answer to a very complicated question. Bruce, you've also written about China. You've written about China for the National Observer. Do you have any insights on the case, anything to add to what Sandy's said?
Well, I mean, the details, not so much. I mean, I think in general, obviously China, the debate now among economists is which is the largest economy in the world? Is it China or the United States? And at the moment, it's kind of academic in the sense that people recognize that China will soon be, if it's not already, will soon be the largest economy in the world. It's also run by one of the most authoritarian, human rights abusing regimes in the world, who have a long history of also stealing industrial secrets from other countries, and particularly the United States, but also from Canada. So it's gotten worse in the sense that the current regime, the current leadership is even more hardline. I mean, this is a country that recently has been revealed to have set up concentration camps again. The sort of democratic, the quasi-democratic space that probably opened up maybe 5 or 6 years ago is gone. And, I traveled to Hong Kong in December and spent a week in Hong Kong to report on what was going on there. And, it's insidious the way the Chinese regime, when they decide they're going to undermine a government or crush dissenting voices, including those in Canada, because if you talk to people in the Chinese community in Canada, the Chinese regime that spends a lot of time trying to crush dissenting voices here. And it's not reported in the mainstream media here because they don't care. So you've got a combination of the new economic bully on the block is China, run by an extraordinarily aggressive regime who will stoop to almost no level to get it, get its way. And the Americans have a lot of somewhat legitimate complaints about China, somewhat, but they're led by, someone who is completely ill-prepared, has no idea how to deal with China. And I think the main case probably speaks to that. He's strategically, he's played this all wrong. And I guess the last point I'll make is that one of the reasons China became an economic power is that American capital, American corporations said, well, there's cheap labor over there. We can move jobs, the manufacturing jobs, all to China. And, essentially the deindustrialization that's occurred in North America, which has been at the expense of Canadian and American workers, was to the benefit of China. So it's a little bit more complicated in the sense that what also betrayed American interest was their own corporations who were happy to do business in China, set up factories there. I mean, all the iPhones that we use, they're all made over there. So it's a very complicated situation.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, both of you, for that. I guess we could talk about that for hours and hours and maybe not get to total clarity on it. So I'm going to turn to some questions from participants. Some of them are going to take us in other directions, so get ready. The first one is, what do either of our panelists think proportional representation would do for the conservatives?
Well, I've written about proportional representation. I did a piece for the National Observer, I think, in the 2015 election about this issue. I think one of the thing that strikes me as the most bizarre reality in Canadian politics, because Trudeau, if you recall, when he got elected in 2015, promised that we would never hold an election using the first past the post system. Well, guess what? We just held another election using the first past the post system. And if he brought in proportional representation, the Tories would never win another majority or even probably in a minority government. So why he doesn't bring in proportional representation is shocking. And I personally think it's because the business community wants, as told the Liberals, we want the option of having the Tories in, and the Liberals have listened. But, basically, yeah, the Tories would be completely screwed if we brought in proportional representation.
Sandy?
I haven't thought closely about this, because on this kind of question, I like to go in and I'm a terrible kind of nerd for going in and looking at, well, just pouring through the writing data and having a look at how things cash out. One of the things that really interests me about voting patterns in Canada is how much more fluid they are than the United States. I mean, in the United States, voting patterns just kind of modulate within, at most, like a 5% sort of variation between the Republican and the Democratic Party. But then when you look at Canadian data, and it can be all over the map. I mean, there were times in the last election, during the election, that the Trudeau Liberals were at 13% support in British Columbia, and the NDP was at 29, and the Conservatives were well above that. And now it's entirely flipped. So there's so much more fluidity there. I would hate to. I haven't cast my mind enough to make an informed kind of statement about what kind of long-term implications there would be, but I tend to think that overall Canada is a more center progressive country, and a proportional representation would move the power center to the left and would leave the Conservatives much more regionally isolated.
Harper would never have been prime minister.
No.
I mean, the NDP and the Liberals would have had the most seats, and there was no reason why Harper would ever be prime minister under a proportional representation.
Mm-hmm. That was a great question, Leslie. Thank you for that one. This is a question from Ted. Are there any conservatives that have reservations about neoliberal ideology, given how its shortcomings have been exposed during the COVID-19 crisis? Bruce, why don't you take that one for starters?
No. Someone I spoke to said, it was a political scientist in Quebec, Christian Nadeau. He said, look, the Tories won. They won on the economic question. And I don't mean that in a good way, and he didn't mean it in a good way, but that basically the ideology, the neoliberalism that they brought in, liberals have not changed. The role of the state is to further corporate interest. That has not changed. So among conservatives, no, the idea, neoliberalism is fantastic. It's not an issue.
Didn't you do your CBC piece on neoliberalism, Bruce?
Yes.
And what do you remember? Can you tell us the title in case anybody wants to look that up?
Is neoliberalism destroying civilization? I think is what the title.
That was for radio, correct?
That's for CBC Radio Ideas.
Yeah, it was brilliant. Okay. Here's a question from Jim Hesser. Do you detect any sense of growing awareness of an importance of addressing climate change more convincingly among those you interview? Bruce.
So just to understand, so he's saying it is among the conservatives I interviewed, are there growing concerns about climate change? I think generally yes. I would say yes. I talked to Tom Flanagan, who's one of the architects, the original ideological architects of the Conservative Party, and we discussed climate change very briefly. And his in a very cynical way, he said, well, look, yeah, they got to get better on it, but it's not going to change anything. We're basically not going to do anything about it, which is, the liberals aren't doing anything really about it either. So, so I think there's a recognition that you've got to at least have something better in writing. Whether they really plan to do anything about it, probably not. When I interviewed Michael Chong, who's one of the few moderates within that party, he was very emphatic in saying, yeah, we've got to be better on that. So yes, there is increasing awareness that they've got to be better on that issue, even if it's in a very cynical way.
I feel like the carbon tax has become the stand-in flag symbol for climate change for the conservatives, and we see this from both Erin O'Toole and Peter MacKay, that no carbon tax or trying to oppose carbon tax as it currently is. I think that there's so much more the conservatives could do, but they are absolutely in the grip of Alberta's take on all of this. And I think this has been one of the most unfortunate things of all. I think it's been devastating to the Alberta economy that the political narrative has been left in the hands of the mid-range the small mid-sized producers who have completely bought into all of this conspiracy theory and rhetoric, which is, we're seeing this kind of thing in the United States now in terms of QAnon and George Soros and Bill Gates and vaccines and all of this. The rhetoric has been so negative and so destructive to actually getting anywhere on this file, which is and always will be for the rest of our natural lives the most pressing and urgent moral imperative that any of us will face, even beyond a pandemic. And there's just a complete lack of any kind of sense of imagination or vision or ability to do anything, because they are held hostage by CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers in Calgary, and the Petroleum Club in Calgary.
Yeah, they're completely the party of big oil, and until that changes, which God knows if that ever will, they're going to be bad on climate change.
And just a note about CAP and big oil in Canada is really it's international oil, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are basically, for the most part, or for a very, very large degree, this is CAP, which has a nice little maple leaf in its logo, represents probably one of the highest concentrations of foreign investment of any sector in the Canadian economy. And it's probably, I've heard all kinds of, I've heard varying degrees of what's the extent of foreign ownership. The scale of foreign ownership, the market capitalization of the foreign foreign companies that are active in the oil sands, or at least before the financial crisis, the latest financial crisis, was well over $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion in market capitalization of the foreign ownership. You know, this whole business, this whole idea that, you know, a few small charities organizing small groups of citizens to oppose it is just kind of, it's just kind of a ludicrous and laughable. But it has had enormous currency, political currency. You know, you're never too rich to think you're a victim, put it that way.
It's been one of the great branding success stories that is.
Copyright that logo.
Right. So this is a question from Wendy Fitch. Wendy's asking, what are the speaker's thoughts on the makeup of the current leadership contenders? Who's running, and more importantly, who isn't?
Well, that's a very good question. So I'll answer the second part first, which is what was interesting about this, the 2017 leadership race and this leadership race, is the stars of Harper's cabinet did not run. Mm-hmm. The one person that was going to be probably the most interesting entree into the potential race, which was Jean Charest. And Charest was interesting because he would have gotten votes in Quebec, which they desperately need, and he, Chancellor, would have gotten a lot of votes in the GTA and the other sort of urban hubs where the Tories are in deep trouble. And Harper stepped off the board of the Conservative Fund to ensure that Jean Charest did not run, and it worked. So none of the big stars like Ronald Ambrose and John Baird, of course Jason Kenney, you know, he's the premier, but he was always one of the big stars of the Tory movement. So that's, and the question is why? Why didn't they run? Well, they didn't run because they all probably know this is still Stephen Harper's party, and they don't want to deal with the, you know, what that all represents. In terms of what's left, you have a cluster of social conservative nut bars, basically. These are extremely marginal characters who have revealed a strong streak of, you know, bigotry and homophobia within the party. And then you have the two leading contenders, which are Aaron O'Toole, who's a fairly obscure Ontario MP, and he was a veteran affairs minister in Harper's government. And then Peter MacKay, the former leader of the PC party back in the 90s. Neither of those guys are tremendously strong or interesting or charismatic or very appealing. And O'Toole's run a campaign which is extremely right-wing to appeal to the social conservative base, and MacKay's been all over the map. I mean, he's, you know, takes an okay position on this, on certain issues, and then abandons this the next day. So mm-hmm. they're having big problems in the leadership race.
Well, and my take on all of this is, you know, one of the people who's not running is Michael Chong, who I think really excited a lot of Canadians. The problem with the Conservative Party is that to be a contender nationally, you have to get past the base, which is far more conservative than the Canadian public. And it's, again, they're almost fighting against themselves. It's an all-white race. You know, here we just gone through, we are still going through the issues around Black Lives Matter and issues surrounding Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Canada. We're an all-white panel. There isn't a major segment in the country that is not aware that we have a lot of work to do, and white people have a lot of work to do in terms of ceding power, giving power, creating opportunities, and advancing and promoting people of color. Well, the Conservative Party has, I believe, although they ran a lot of people of color in the last election, they only elected, I think they're 8%, if I'm not mistaken. That should probably be double checked by somebody, but the last time I looked, it was 8% of their elected representatives are people of color. Well, once again, you're looking at Ontario. Look at Ontario. Look at Greater Toronto. Look at a lot of the urban centers, Montreal. We just have so far to go. And So I think that a lot of the major players, the Ronna Ambroses, the James Moores, the Bairds, these people didn't run. And I don't think it was just because of Stephen Harper. I think it's because they knew that right now the Conservative Party does not have an answer. I think if any of them could have been elected prime minister, it wouldn't have mattered. Stephen Harper would have been long in the rearview mirror if you could have, if to any leader that could take that, could win a majority government.
Thanks, Sandy. And Bruce, can you tell us the story of Mulroney's leadership campaign, the Booney strategy, where you like pretend to be right-wing in private and moderate in public?
Sorry, you mean when Brian Mulroney won in the 80s? Sorry, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
So the significant difference between the old progressive conservatives and the party that Harper creates, the Conservative Party of Canada, was that the PCs recognized that we have to be a center party to win power. And the person who was most sort of genius at figuring this all out was Brian Mulroney. He wins 2 solid, overwhelming majorities in 1984 and 1988, and he destroys the Liberals in Quebec in both elections, which you know Quebec was the bastion, and they had what was called the Big Tent approach, which was the party.
Lucien Bouchard, they had. Yeah.
You know, and the Big Tent approach was that social conservatives, red Tories, environmentalists, people sort of all walks of life, fiscal conservatives, could all be under the same umbrella. And it worked until it didn't work. And it didn't work until when Preston Manning in 1987 creates the Reform Party. It basically takes all of those Western seats. And then Lucien Bouchard bolts the party, I think it was 1990-91, creates a Bloc Québécois, and he takes all of those Quebec seats. And in 1993, there's the disastrous election where they literally win 2 seats. Mm-hmm. And the PC party never recovered. Mm-hmm. And the new iteration of the Conservative Party is a much more narrow, it's a much more hardline conservative. And guys like Harper and guys like Tom Flanagan, the so-called Calgary School of ideologues, they didn't like the red Tories. They didn't like the liberal wing. And everything they've done is to ensure that element has been marginalized. Mm-hmm.
And it's ironic because the whole theory was to try and create this big tent, but the one part of the big tent that they wanted to kick out was the part that had the biggest proportion of votes, which is the Ontario Conservatives.
Uh-huh. Well, you guys, there's so much more we could talk about. I see some great questions about climate change. Our participants keep trying to bring us back to climate change, which I really appreciate because I think everybody on this panel would agree that that is the big issue of our time and it's not going away. The pandemic has certainly taken a lot of attention away from it, but it doesn't mean, we're not still thinking about it at National Observer. We're coming up to the end of the hour, so I want to thank you both so much. You're so central to what makes National Observer what it is. And I am always in awe of the reporting and the writing that you do. So thank you for your time tonight, Bruce Livesey, Sandy Garossino, and a few words about what we're doing here at Canada's National Observer. Canada's National Observer is primarily, it's becoming more and more, we're going on 60% funded by readers. It's so important, the support that we get from your subscriptions. I'm guessing a lot of you on this call tonight are probably already subscribers, but if you are, thank you so much. It really means so much to the work we're doing here. As you heard Bruce talk about his story, I think you can kind of get the feeling to talk to 30 people, to spend that amount of time, all the calls that Bruce made where somebody didn't take his call, maybe he called 50 people, I don't know, to write the kind of story that Bruce writes, the kind of story that Sandy writes. This is time consuming. work that takes draft after draft. And we have Lori Few, who's also somewhere listening on this call, who's just a brilliant editor who works a lot with Sandy and Bruce on their stories. So your subscriptions are making all this possible. I want to thank you for that. I can't thank you enough. And I want to encourage those of you who aren't subscribers yet to consider subscribing. Next week, we'll be back with our last conversations segment with Emily Gilpin from Brazil, talking to us about how COVID is ripping through the indigenous population in Brazil and how hard that is. And she's down there in Brazil, and it'll be so interesting to hear from her. So I hope you'll all join us next week on Conversations. Thanks so much for being here. Stay safe, stay well. See you next time. Thanks, Sandy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Bruce.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Andy.
Bye.